Ladies and gents, welcome back to the channel. Now I'm on my way to a local venue today, Thurleston Lake. It's a lake run by Green Hills Club in Leicestershire. The place is solid with carp. We should have no problems with catching fish whatsoever. Now today is all about method feeder fishing, but we're doing it with a bit of a twist. We're going to be feeding lots of bait. It's a method that I used a couple of weeks ago to win the Feeder Masters qualifier at Hullcroft Fishery with some beautiful big fish. It worked really well on that day, and it won me some money, it caught me loads of fish. I'm going to show you the basics today, and hopefully you too can put it to good effect.
Well folks, you join me on a beautiful day on a beautiful local venue, and today is all about one thing: feeding some bait. It's that time of year where we can get some bait into the water, actually attract fish and hold fish in the swim. Obviously during the colder months you seem to be hunting fish rather than actually pulling them into the swim. You're casting towards fish, or you're casting towards an area where you think there might be a pocket of fish. Now is the time, now the water temperature's increased, now's the time that we can actually make an influence, put some bait in and draw fish into the swim. Like I say, hold them into the swim as well. So, plan for today, it's all about method feeder fishing, and I want to show you a tactic that actually won me quite a bit of money and qualified me for the Feeder Masters final this year as well. The venue was Hullcroft Fishery, and I caught down the middle, not towards any islands, down the middle, in open water, boshing baiting. And by boshing baiting I mean feeding big amounts of bait with a boshing feeder and on the boshing setup. First of all, I want to talk you through my standard method feeder setup before we move on to the feeding rod and the boshing rod. So, method feeder gear. I've got 10-foot rod. This is a nice soft reactor core XZ feeder rod, perfect for this sort of short chuck commercial carp fishery work. I've got 8-pound line on the reel. I want something that's no nonsense, really robust, not going to let me down, sinks nice and quickly as well. 8-pound line fits the bill. It's inline feeders here today, and it was inline feeders when I won that match at Hullcroft as well. No problem. For me, I use the little gripper feeders from Mid-Air. They seem to sit on the bottom nicely, they hold on the bottom nicely. Obviously they're in line, so if a fish does snap the main line, if the main line snaps for any reason, obviously the fish isn't dragging your feeder around. I've got a little 2.5 inch hook length there. That's 0.18. I've got a size 12 hook on. It's an eyed barbless type hook there. And then I've got a push stop on the hair rig. The reason I'm using such a short hook length is because of the underwater filming that we've done recently for our Edge channel, me and Lee Kerry's Edge channel. We found the short hook length was a million times better, and if you've not seen that footage, check it out on the Edge website. The reason I'm using a push stop instead of a little bare net is because I want to hair rig the baits that I'm actually feeding. When I'm feeding a lot of bait, I always feel it's better to fish the bait that you're feeding on the hook. Now if I was casting out a single method feeder, sort of hunting fish as I like to call it, casting around the swim, starting new swims up all the time, a little wafter or wowser, something like that, a little bright bait, a little mini boiler, that'd be a perfect hook bait. But because I'm actually feeding bait, I want to put the bait that I'm feeding on the hair. That's why I've got a little push stop there. So that is the method feeder setup. Now let's move on to the BOSHER setup. Now because there's the potential of feeding quite a lot of bait with this tactic, you want a boshing setup that's not going to let you down. For this short range sort of boshing style, I like to use a little 9-foot, it's a stalking carp rod, really easy to chuck out. It's got loads of power in it as well, so obviously you want something that's much more powerful than your standard feeder rod. We're not going to be playing fish on it. It's purely there as a feeding tool. This is sort of like a scaled down version of a spod rod for a carper. So you can pick these rods up, they're not overly expensive, you just want something that's not going to let you down. I've got 12-pound on the reel, again, no nonsense gear, just never going to break when you're chucking out big feeders. And on the end, simply a nice big open end feeder. Now you might notice there's no lead on that feeder at all. The venue here is only shallow, I'm only chucking a short distance, and I want the bait to empty up from that feeder as quick as possible. So the reason I don't need any weight on the feeder is because the bait inside the feeder is going to provide that weight. I can get to the required casting distance, then I can whoosh the bait out on the surface, create a carpet of bait on the lake bed. That is the reason that we use the BOSHER. Method feeders are brilliant for setting a trap and catching fish, but you can't pile loads of bait around a method feeder. You can't physically put enough bait around that method feeder to keep fish in your peg. So we need to feed with the BOSHER, cast the method feeder over the top, set that trap and catch the fish. The BOSHER is the attractor, the method feeder is the trap to actually catch the fish. So folks, let's put it into practice. There's a few fish moving around. I can't wait any longer. This is going to be our first drop in, and I'm pretty certain that the fish will want some bait. So I'm going to go straight in with the boshing feeder. I've got a really nice mixture of hemp and corn on the side tray. I call it a non-offensive mix. At this time of year, there's going to be no fish that shy away from that bait. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to fill the feeder with hemp and corn, and then I'm going to cap it, just nip it into the feeder with the micros that I'm going to put around my method feeder. Obviously I've soaked those micros up beforehand. You don't want to nip it in too hard, but there's a bit of a balancing act because you want the bait to come out pretty quick. Gentle lob out, hit the clip, whoosh the bait out. Obviously where allowed, I like to use braid because it's so much more direct. You can really whip the rod back and get that bait to come out on the surface. Now I'm only fishing 18 metres today. It's a perfect distance. It's beyond the range of a lot of pole anglers, so obviously it's that sort of middle ground where the fish don't get caught very often, but it's a brilliant area for this sort of method to work. Not quite bomb fishing distance, but obviously a bit further than those pole anglers around you. Both rods have been clipped up at the same distance. This is where your measuring sticks come in massive use. Obviously, it's a simple case of deciding where you want to fish and whipping your boshing rod around the measuring sticks and your method feeder rod around the measuring sticks. Obviously, you're fishing bang on then. Clip them both up. You can't go wrong if you do that. Now, I've just put that bait in. Quite often, you want to cast over the top of that bait pretty quick because, as you can see, the fish will come in quite quick when they really want to feed. So I'm just going to load this feeder up. Sometimes it's a case of loading the feeder up before you chuck the BOSHER in, so you can chuck straight on top of it before they clear out that bait. It's amazing how quickly they can clear out the bait. I'm going for a grain of corn. As I said, quite often when I'm fishing like this, I like to use the bait that I'm feeding, so I'm actually sort of matching the hatch, as it were. I'm just going to fill the mould on my method feeder, plop that little grain of corn in there, fill it up to the top, give it a nice squeeze. It's a brilliant method, this is, because quite often you account for some really big fish as well. Those fish that have probably seen this little method feeder trap a million times, but they've not really seen it in amongst a lot of loose feed. So I'm going to just gently lob this out, bang on that spot. There we go, right in the middle of where that bait's gone in. Now I'm using the line clip, but I've got a line marker, and just mark the line in front of where the line goes around the clip, because obviously if we hook a fish that decides to tear off, we can quickly whip the line from under the line clip. In actual fact, I'm not even closing the bail arm, so I can get to that clip really fast. We can whip the line from underneath that line clip and let it run if we have to. And there we go, we are fishing. As always, let's get him out, get the old stopwatch out. As with all my method feeder fishing, I like to get the stopwatch going just so we get a feel for the day, especially early on. Obviously judge our bite times via that stopwatch, and obviously it'll tell us whether we need to start upping the feed or cutting back on the feed. I mean, I've got some really big boshing feeders as well. It's a tactic we use a lot in the World Champs actually. We put in a lot of baits like leam and maybe softer ground baits, and we use massive feeders. The biggest you're allowed is 5 centimetres by 7 centimetres. It's like the size of a Coke can. We're using proper carp rods to chuck them out. And in some circumstances, even in this country, when we're feeding loads of bait, trying to hold fish at maybe venues like Boston in the summer, that sort of venue where there's a lot of fish feeding, we'll end up using those big feeders, boshing that bait in, holding fish, and then chucking your little method feeder over the top. That's your ultimate fish catching trap. But as we keep saying, that little tiny parcel of bait is just not enough bait to pull any amount of fish into the swim. Now I'm hoping that these fish gather on that bait quite quickly, and we'll work out whether we need to maybe even feed two big BOSHER feeders to get the fish there, or whether we need to cut back a little bit. But I think that stopwatch will tell us that while we're fishing. Be nice to get a quick bite though, and it'll just give us a really good read of the day. There's a lot of fish cruising around in the upper layers, so I'm hoping they'll go down. There was a lot of fish, probably 2 or 3 fish come up on the spot where we put that bait in, maybe just feeding on the oil from the hemp maybe. If they go down, we should be in for a good day. I always think hemp's a really good addition to this sort of heavy baiting scenario, because it creates that oil slick on the surface, it pulls fish in from a long distance, but obviously the actual bait that they want to eat is on the deck, so that's the source of that oil and all that flavour, and that's where they'll hopefully where they'll sit in the end. But you can see it's nice and patient, 2 rod rests, no, not twitching the feeder, keeping the rod nice and still. A little tiny line bite then. I'm imagining as the day goes on and we feed more and more bait, we'll be getting more and more indications with fish in the swim. Another liner, getting some indications now, so there's a few fish around. And this isn't a method that I'd probably fish from the start of a session. Maybe on a red hot summer's day where the fish are really feeding and you're fishing for a really big weight, that might be the case, but I always think the second half of a session, this is a really good tactic. And it's something that has probably came around because of the feeder only matches that we've started to fish. Obviously in the past you've maybe primed that line with a catapult, maybe fire some 8mm over the top, and that's a great way of fishing. But this is just another way of targeting that area just beyond pole range, that area that those fish are just not used to being caught. So we've got the first fish of the day. Probably took a little bit longer than I expected. Sort of 4 minutes that cast. But the good thing about putting some bait in is you know that even if your method feeder gets cleared off, if a fish comes in and dislodges your method feeder, which we know can happen, and we know that the fish can clear the bait around your feeder quite quickly, we know that because we've fed that BOSHER full of bait and I've put a hook bait on that's obviously matching the hatch of what I am feeding, we're still fishing. You know, we're not sitting there with just a single hook bait in the middle of the lake. We're actually fishing because we've got some bait round, obviously round the area. So there we go, nice ghosty to start with. Here's a nice fish. Single grain of corn on a method feeder, what could be simpler than that? Hooks just fell out. Probably about 3 or 4 pound. We're hoping for some bigger boys today. There we go, beautiful ghosty to start with. Let's see if we can catch a bigger one. Now, as always, And for anyone that's watched any other videos of mine, you'll know I love setting the trap. So we've caught a fish, now we need to reset that trap and catch the next one. So we're going to get the bosher out again, fill it up with that hemp and corn mix. Lob it out nice and gently. And you can see, because that feeder's got no lead on, it's so easy to empty that feeder high up in the water. The bait comes out of it a lot easier as well, because the lead isn't getting in the way of the bait coming out. And now we've got a big area of attraction around this little method feeder that I'm going to chuck in. So single grain of corn again, that seemed to work last time. Tiny little pile of pellets in the mould, lay my hook bait on top and then fill the mould to the brim and give it a nice big squeeze. Obviously if you've prepared your pellets correctly, you can give them a nice squeeze and they'll still break down. The idea behind a method feeder is a nice little pile of pellets around a hook bait, not a blob of pellets with your hook bait wedged inside. You want everything to break down nicely into a nice soft little mound. Right, bang on the spot. Just taking my time to sink the line, being so careful to sink the line. Start the stopwatch again. See if we can make it 2 in 2 for the bosher. I mean, it's a really simple way of fishing, but obviously it's really effective as well. And you can see that slick of hemp out there. I hope you can see the oil from that hemp. It's obviously pulling fish from a long distance, that is. You can see the odd fish just cruising in that oil slick as well. And hemp's such a brilliant bait for attracting fish. Tiny indication. It's always good to get a few line bites with this method. I mean, the method feed I'm using is 20 gram because we're only casting a short distance, but if I was getting loads of big liners, or if I was fishing on a steep shelf, I'd probably use a 30 gram method feeder just to make sure that the feeder stayed in one place. But you've got a lovely mix out there now of hemp, corn, micro pellets, and in the middle is my cherry on the top, my little method feeder, which hopefully any second now fish will slowly approach and suck in my grain of corn and try and make off with it. Big drop back bite. So we've had a big drop back bite. That's a fish picking up the bait, shaking its head, knocking the feeder out of its, knocking the hook out of its mouth against the weight of the feeder. So a fish who's been in the swim means we need to refeed again. It's an active method. We can't just sit there, put a load of bait in and sit on it all day. It's all about feeding. those drop back bites, you've got to be so fast on those bites. And obviously I wasn't concentrating fully. Again, if you've watched any of the underwater stuff that we've done on our other channel, there's a beautiful clip of a fish shaking its head against the weight of the feeder and dislodging the hook. I mean, a massive eye-opener that was. Showed how the fish reacts when it picks up the bait and how it deals with the hook as well. And I should have been a little bit faster on that, but gives us a chance to reset everything, reset the swim. I'll say feed again. So grain of corn seems to be working as the bait. A little bit of a schoolboy error that was, missing that bite, but we'll miss a few bites. It's important to recognise that a fish has had that though, and there is a need to start the whole process again. Again, really nice and gently sink the line. I'm not even turning the reel handle, just putting the rod tip under the water. And there we are. I like to leave the tip as slack as possible, to be honest. Just like to have the line tight and the tip nice and straight, so there's not a big bend in the tip. I'm always wary of a tight line going to the feed. I always think the fish is a little bit cautious of that tight line. And if I keep the line tight between the feeder and the tip, I can still see a drop back bite. I can see that line suddenly drop slack. Obviously if a fish tears it off, it will try and drag the rod in and the rod tip will tow round. Again, because we're only fishing short, I've not turned the bail arm over on the reel. I've turned the line clip round to face me, and if I do hook a big fish and it kites away pretty quickly, I can always quickly unclip the line clip without the bail arm getting in the way. I'm hoping we can catch, well, at least hook a fish this chuck. Hopefully it's a bigger fish than that first one. There's some beautiful fish in this lake. That hemp slick's working really well now. We've got a line of flat water going into the far corner of the lake, and I've got to be pulling fish towards me. I mean, obviously on some venues you might be using luncheon meat, you might be using 6mm pellets to create a better feed. It doesn't have to be hemp and corn, it could be whatever you think, but the thinking behind it is just getting some bait into the swim and being active. The last thing we want to be doing is getting here, arriving here in the morning, piling 10 or 15 boshers out and then fishing over it all day. That's not the way to fish it. It's about building the peg gradually and setting the trap for each individual fish with a large amount of bait. Hopefully you can see why I'm using corn on the hook rather than sort of a mini boiler or a little wafters type bait. I just think a little mini boiler or wafter would probably look a little bit out of place with all that other bait on the bottom. So you imagine a fish that's obviously grazing on that loose feed corn, that bait we've put in with that big feeder, and then all of a sudden he comes across the same single piece of corn, but it's right next to a little pile of micro pellets. But obviously maybe with a big bright bait, it might just arise a little bit of suspicion and he might not take it. See a little line even with that slack line in front of the tip, you can just see the line tightening slightly when you get a little line bite. I always think the slacker the tip the better, as long as you can still see a little indication. There we go, I think he's on. So we've had 3 chucks, we've had a nice ghosty first chuck, and then obviously we missed that bite, schoolboy error, not concentrating, whatever you want to call it, but we reset the trap. That was the important thing. We learned from that and we reset the trap. And then obviously we've hooked this fish on the 3rd chuck. Obviously we're on decent gear as well, so we can play the fish with a bit of authority. Size 12 hook, 018. I mean the size 12 hook's not there for playing the fish necessarily, but I always think a nice big hook's great for hooking fish on a self-hooking setup. Obviously a greater chance of the hook point pricking the fish. There we go, another nice little fish, probably about £4 this time. Cracking little fish. No need for a keep net today, we're only having a mess around. Just put him back. I'm going to put a bit more bait in. I'm hoping that showed you the merits of the BOSHER, combined with a method feeder approach. I'm going to carry on, catch a few more fish. Until next time folks, tight lines.